Good morning. The room's filling up. It's a well-subscribed session for our first webinar of 2021. Just give it 30 seconds for those to filter in. We were oversubscribed for this session, which is always good. Okay, starting to level out. So I think I'll give it another 10 seconds and then we will crack on, and obviously people can join us over the next few minutes if they choose to. Right, let's crack on. For those, obviously this is a webinar, so I can't see you. Normally I host Zoom meetings where I can get to see everybody's face. My name's Andrew Harrison. I'm director of the Event Supplier and Services Association. And for the first webinar of 2021, we're hosting a session on exhibition logistics and Brexit. So if that's not the intended purpose of your visit today, then you've got a few moments to back out of it. Not that the room's locked or anything, but yeah, you've got a couple of moments to back out if that's not what you intended logging into today. And I'm really happy to have Tim Marchant and Dan Flower from Agility. Dan works down at Excel London, and Tim is his counterpart up at the NEC, but they're going to do their own introductions in a minute and talk you through the session and how it's going to run and how the Q&A will run and things like that. And I will turn my camera off and I will turn my microphone off and disappear into the background, and I'll rejoin right at the end. So thank you. Over to you, Dan and Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And yeah, good morning, everybody, and a very belated Happy New Year to you all. So thanks for you all logging in and sort of joining our just a little presentation about exhibition logistics and Brexit, which I hope you'll all find informative this morning. A very brief introduction. Who don't know me, my name is Dan Flower. I'm the operations manager based at Excel in London, and with me is Tim Marchant, who is the operations manager at NEC in Birmingham. So just to give you an idea of this morning's kind of format, feel free to take notes, but we will actually have a PDF document for all of you, which we will share after the webinar today. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat box. We are going to try not to engage ourselves in the chat today. But if you do have any questions for us, there's a Q&A box down the bottom. Feel free to put in any questions on any of the topics that we highlight as we go along. And certainly I'll do my best to jump in and answer them as we go along. If you forget to answer any questions or you remember some at the end, we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation, which we can answer, then if you've forgotten anything. So I hope you find it informative. I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to take forward and give the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. So just to sort of start with, from a topics perspective, the idea of what we're trying to do today is just give you a bit of an overview and hopefully point you in the right direction. There's no one size fits all easy solution to this. And sort of as we go through some of the slides that we're showing you on here, there are links on the screen. So the idea is like we sort of mentioned, is that at the end of this, we can make this presentation available in sort of PDF format so that when you go to specific pages, there's kind of links available to sort of point you in the right direction. So the kind of topics that we're going to look at is just sort of have a quick review of where we were at the back end of last year, try and highlight some of the responsibilities that now fall onto you due to Brexit. Then obviously once we've highlighted those responsibilities, a little bit of a how-to as to how you might be able to work your way through those things. Looking specifically at exhibition events, and because obviously the temporary movements involved in that and how that's different to normal logistics as such. And then we'll kind of just do a finish off with a bit of a quick advice summary, if you like. So to start with then, just looking at this is a sample of the type of guidance that was out there at the back end of last year, because obviously the big change for most people was that customs clearance was going to be on the table for people who operated in the EU, and that wouldn't have been an issue before. And I suppose that the guidance, there's kind of three types of businesses that were out there. There are businesses that purely operate within the UK. So for them, Brexit's not really an issue. You've got the ones that operated internationally outside of the EU. So they would have been used to some of the new things that have been put into place now. So things like customs clearance, having to work through commodity codes, working through duties and taxes, that sort of thing. Whereas you had a whole tranche of people, if you like, that purely operated within the UK and in the EU. And for them, the idea of EORI numbers and customs clearances and commodity codes was a complete unknown. And I suppose it's for those people that have had kind of the biggest culture shock. So moving on to what we see as kind of your responsibilities as shippers. So one of the first things that you'll have to look at is check whether you have or get an EORI number. And on the next page within the presentation, we'll sort of give you a little bit more detail on that. Another responsibility of yourselves will be commercial invoices. You'll have to prepare these for the goods that are being shipped. Some of you will have done this before, some not. And then we'll try and focus on some of the key aspects that you need to put within those commercial invoices. Another thing that you'll need to look at is you as a trader, a shipper, will need to find someone to do the customs declarations and some of the customs documentation for you. It's a case of finding a suitable agent. That agent could be someone like us, exhibition logistics specialist. There are other companies like us in the industry, and there are other options that you can look at as well. I understand that obviously a number of ESSA members they operate their own trucks, especially as they move around the UK and in Europe before. Brexit will bring a whole host of responsibilities for people who want to operate trucks within Europe. We won't go into massive detail on those things, but we'll sort of point you in the right direction and touch on a couple of the key areas. And I suppose the other thing from a responsibility point of view is that, and this is kind of one of the key things, is that you will have to think of that entire chain from it leaving your premises to where it gets to at whatever exhibition event it is in Europe, as well as looking at that export side and getting that customs documentation out of the UK. You need to be speaking to people at the other end, whether you do that through your UK forward or whether you liaise directly with the agent for the event. You're going to have to speak to them to ensure that all the details that they need for the import into Germany, Italy, wherever it is, that's all being covered off at the same time as well. So I'll crack on because I can see there's sort of no questions at the moment. So just touching on the first subject, an EORI number. So effectively, these are economic operator registration identification number. Effectively, the number is a way of identifying a company and the customs declarations and moves and operations that they're involved in. The system's been around for a number of years. It was introduced in 2009, and there was a previous system before that as well. You need an EORI number to import stuff into the UK and also for exports as well. Under the old EU system, all of our numbers were linked to a database, the EU database. But obviously, as we've now left the EU, we're no longer attached to that, but EORI, we're still following that EORI number system. Now, as part of the transition process, the UK government decided to auto-enroll all VAT registered businesses into the EORI number system. So in theory, you should, if you didn't have an EORI number before, you should have one now. Now, we as a company already had an EORI number, so we haven't obviously got a new one through the post or anything like that. So this is something that you'll have to just go double check yourselves after this, just to make sure that you've got an EORI number. Like I say, you should have been auto-enrolled, but I'm sure there's going to be companies in the process that were missed for various reasons. If you are based in or deal with Northern Ireland, there's actually a separate customs setup as well. The EORI numbers for Northern Ireland all start with XI. So if you're doing any transitions between mainland UK and Northern Ireland, there's a separate number that you need for that as well. And just if you find that you do need an EORI number at the last minute, be aware that even though the application process is quite easy, it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to apply. And you know, the extract on the right-hand side of the page is from the EORI number webpage, is that, you know, once you've gone through, you might get that EORI number straight away, but it's still going to take about 48 hours for you to be able to use that in any custom system. So from an EORI number perspective, it's just something that you have to do once, but make sure you do it well in advance of any exports that you're looking to do. So I can see that I think we've now got a question.
A question pop up there, Tim, from Willigan to Hayes, which is, does the EORI number remain the same? Is it per company, per event or logistics partner?
Yeah, no, it's basically per company. So in effect, it's actually based on your VAT number. So what you'll find is that your VAT number, that forms part of the application. And then at the end of that, they give you a new number, which is effectively GB, the 9 numbers from your VAT number, plus usually another 3 digits on the end, which is the EORI number. And then that stays linked to that company. And what that does is that number is then used on all of the customs declarations. So HMRC can see directly which companies are importing what goods.
Did you want to touch on, Tim, about the event logistics EORI for imports into the UK? I
Yeah,
mean, it's slightly different from the export, which
yeah,
might be the complication here.
Yeah, there isn't a one size fits all thing here for this. There are different mechanisms to do temporary imports into the UK, especially in and around carnets. There's certain codes that you can use. It purely depends on the type of import that it is. And if I'm being honest, between the agents that are officials on, let's say, UK-based shows, there's going to be slight variations, I would expect, as to how they operate. There is some rules that are in place, but the interpretation of it can come a different way. So what we might do as a company to import goods into the UK for an event isn't necessarily what another competitor, for want of a better word, they wouldn't necessarily do it the same way. Broadly, we have to follow the same rules. It's just that there's different ways that you can actually get to that goal. Okay.
There's another question popped up, which is about carnets. It's a good question. We're going to touch on carnets in a few slides' time. So if that's okay, we're going to come back to that question.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll move on. So next topic on the list is commercial and shipping invoices. And for some of you, you will have done these before. I suppose for some, this could be a completely new thing for you. And when you look at the events that you're going to, you'll tend to find that a lot of shipping instructions, if you go to those agents, they'll have specific templates that might help you. And some are sort of geared specifically around certain events to kind of help you and ease that customs clearance process. But a commercial invoice itself is a key part of that customs declaration process. The basics are obviously adding the shipper and consignee address and making sure that the EORI number is going onto that that invoice as well. And obviously, like any other invoice, you'd have a description of goods, the quantity, and the value of items as well. Where you need to kind of do a little bit more work from a commercial invoice customs clearance point of view is that you need to include things like tariff headings, country of origin, terms of shipment, custom status, and weight, because all of those things are needed for the purpose of the customs entry. We'll kind of touch on some of these things like tariff numbers and bits and pieces later on in the presentation, but we just wanted to kind of highlight the key things that you need on these invoices. You may find as well that some countries, this isn't just specific to the EU, but when you're doing international as well, you'll need to include certain declarations on the invoice. A common one when you're doing exhibitions is that you're basically stating that they are for a display at an international exhibition and they will return in full after the show. And just on the sample that we've got here, we've kind of just highlighted some of those key differences, if you like. So country of origin, tariff numbers, custom status, that sort of thing. But like I say, each, an invoice template might be different for a different show, and you're just going to have to sort of work through those as you receive them. So, questions?
We have a question about an EORI number, Tim, which is, would a company need an EORI number if they're using a logistics company to deliver their goods, or is it purely the logistics company that needs an EORI? Just so that's come from Kane Simpson. I mean, Kane, just to make you aware, every company that's doing an export from the UK to a European or overseas event will need an EORI number. It's not the logistics company that you're working with, it is the actual exporter themselves. So that would be your own company. And I hope that...
Yeah, and just to sort of follow on from that as well, the idea of the EORI number is to establish fiscal responsibility, as in who's going to be liable for any duties and taxes. And one of the I think it's touched on in the EORI page as well. One of the key things about EORI numbers is that freight forwarders, in effect, for general imports and stuff like that, is that you cannot use your freight forwarder's EORI number for general importations and stuff like that, because that's not linking that customs entry back to the company that's actually fiscally responsible for duties and taxes.
Okay, we have a question from Luke as well about an EORI for the Northern Ireland. And if we're sending a stand to Northern Ireland, do we need a different EORI that starts with XI? Or is it just if we're a Northern Ireland based company?
I'll be honest, I am not 100% au fait with all of the Northern Irish rules at the moment, and they are still transitioning as well. There's a little bit of an expectation that some of this stuff will change as well. My primary understanding is that there is more of an issue going from mainland GB into Northern Ireland than there is the other way, because obviously the EU, because Northern Ireland is treated as the EU, there's a little bit more of a block from their side than there is ours at the moment. I expect things to settle out and things to become a little bit clearer. On Northern Ireland, just to maybe help this process better, if you, on the EORI page, or you might need to Google it, there's something called Trader Support Service, I think it is, or Trader Support Scheme. And effectively, there is a specific thing that you can sign up for that helps you specifically with Northern Ireland movements. Obviously we're sort of quite early into this new year and I haven't had a chance to have a look at that in great detail, but for anybody that's sort of working in and around Northern Ireland and doing it at the moment, that trader support scheme is what is advised to kind of sign up and register with that, and they will apparently help guide you through the process. I hope that helps.
Okay. There's a couple of other questions coming about commercial invoices, which I'm going to kind of touch on here. I mean, a question from Jack about is length, width and height dimensions mandatory in all goods? I would say on this, Jack, every destination, every city, every country is different on the commercial invoice. Certainly there are some destinations that would require length, width and height dims stated on every single item on the commercial invoice. Some countries are more lenient, some countries are a lot stricter, and this is something you'll need to check out every single time you do an export to a European country. Essentially, it just means you need to be more prepared going forward than you possibly were in the past. And I hope that answers the question. And James has asked a question about, does client giveaways cause an issue if they don't come back? Just to touch on that, not specifically. I mean, giveaways such as, T-shirts, baseball caps, USB sticks, they're all fine generally to be given away. You just might be liable for the import duty, tax or VAT in that specific country or city that it's going to. Like I said before with the DIMs, it's worth checking out in advance with your shipper or your broker what the duties or VAT charges may be for those specific items. Each giveaway will carry a different level of duty, which Tim will touch on in the presentation in the next couple of pages. Do you want to move on, Tim? We've got a couple of other questions here, but rather than go through every question individually, I'm going to make some notes on these and we'll come back to them in the Q&A section at the end, and I hope that's all right for everybody.
Okay, so we'll move on to sort of just trying to detail things a little bit more to tariff numbers. So you might hear them under a variety of names: tariff numbers, tariff headings, HS codes, but effectively these are specific codes that are used to classify goods. And then based on that number, it helps to then attach the right customs tariff or rules to that. And these can, obviously some items are restricted. So if you have, if a weapon comes in and you enter, a tariff number for a firearm or whatever, then that's going to flag up within the system. And then obviously the restrictions are applied to that. Some items will have their own number, if you like. And then others will fall into another category, if you like. As an example, an apple would have its own tariff number. And then if you look in the same chapter as where apples are, as you work through other fruits like strawberries, raspberries, this, that, and the other, you'll see some of those listed. And then when you get to the end of it, there's just another line that says other fruits, and that has its own tariff number. So effectively, you kind of work through the ones that do have their own tariff numbers. And if your product falls into another, then you would use that one. UK requirements are that you need to have an 8-digit tariff number for export purposes on the customs entry. If you're doing an import, there's an extra 2 digits. And primarily, these numbers are sort of fairly standardized globally. There are variations. The first 4 digits tend to be the same because we all kind of roughly operate to the same chapters. It's when you get down to digits more so 7, 8 and 9 and 10, that's where you really see the main variations, because obviously they're then used to kind of apply different levels of duties, taxes, that sort of thing, and restrictions. The little screenshot on the right hand side is an extract from the government website, the trade tariff page. There's this trade tariff and commodity checker tool available, and it is very good to use. It's got some extra how-to classification guidance in there. There's a telephone helpline available, and just to sort of show you how it works, I'm just going to take you through a couple of slides as an example of how this works. So in theory, if you're on this page and you press that Start Now button, it would take you to a page that looked like this, and effectively it lists all of the chapters out, and it has a little search bar at the top. So for the sample that I've done for this presentation, I've typed in the word T-shirt, and then once you press return on that, obviously it brings back the results for that. Now T-shirts fall into it's not specifically its own number, but it sort of falls into a chapter called Articles of Apparel and Clothing, Accessories Knitted or Crocheted. This is the 61 piece. There's then a separate line here for T-shirts with a second code here. And effectively, all you do is, as you're doing this, you just follow the links, the hyperlinks through. So as you press that button, you then get other options. So at this point, for a T-shirt, I then need to look at what material it's made from. Is it purely cotton? Is it other materials? And then that kind of takes you to a next set of links. So if I chose T-shirts of cotton, this is my 10-digit number, or 8 digits. I can ignore the last 2. And once you click on that final one, it will bring you up details for that page. It will advise you what kind of VAT is applicable, what duty. This page can sort of run on a lot further, and it will kind of give you certain restrictions by countries. So it might be that T-shirts from China carry a much higher duty rating than ones from, I don't know, from Germany or somewhere like that. And obviously there's some export bits as well. So, and also I mentioned before about restrictions. So if you're dealing with a restricted product or licensable product or foodstuffs and bits and pieces like that, then on this same page as well, there'll be a whole host of extra information that will sort of guide you as to what other documentation you may or may not need. So, any other questions based off? Do you want to?
Yeah, there are some questions here, which I'm just trying to answer as we go along on the Q&A section. But I think there's some questions just about commercial invoices, which I think we'll try and touch on when we get to the end, Tim.
Okay.
I'll make a note on them. So.
All right. I shall crack on then. So transit documents. Effectively, so this is getting more into the custom side now and the movement side of it. A transit document is a document that basically allows goods to move between 2 locations. So if we take an example of if you're moving something from the UK to Germany, the idea is that you create your transit document in the UK. It's going to go to Germany. It has a specific office that it has to go to. But when it transits out of the UK into France, Holland, Belgium, whichever port option you're doing, you don't have to do a customs clearance into that country. Effectively, the liability, the duty is suspended between those 2 customs offices that are on the document. And in effect, that truck can drive from location A to location B. You may find that, customs in Holland, France, wherever may still stop you, want to look at the documentation to prove that you haven't got a transit document, that sort of thing, but they wouldn't be looking for you to do any sort of customs clearances in those countries. And then obviously once you get to Germany, you would present that to your to the customs office that you're going to, and then they will go through a process of discharging that transit document and doing a customs entry into that country. The system's been around for a long time. It was in place before Brexit. As an example that we would have used before, if we were sending shipments from the UK to Switzerland, we would use a transit document for that, for it to move across the EU. Another example would have been if we did a show, say here in the UK, Chinese exhibitor sends a machine across the show, we temporarily import it into the UK, they then sell that machine. Because the duty has been suspended here in the UK, even though it's in Germany, I can't just freely move those goods across there. So I would then create a transit document to transfer that liability from the UK to Germany, and then the goods will be cleared into Germany from there. They are very, very useful documents because obviously they stop you needing to customs clear across every border that you do. However, I suppose the one negative of this type of document is that it basically places a financial fiscal liability on the company that raises the transit document. So you may be the shipper, you ask us to do a transit document for you. It's not you that holds that liability, it's us. So if something goes wrong in that chain and doesn't work, then customs are not going to come after you, they're going to come after us. So what you might find is that if you're trying to operate your own trucks, because that company that's generating that transit document for you doesn't necessarily know that you're going to follow all the rules and turn up at that right customs office correctly, they may not be that willing to do transit documents for you for the sake of, you know, £100 or whatever, if the liability they're going to get hit with could be £10,000. So it's just something that obviously when you're looking at transit documents, you're going to have to speak to your providers to find out what they are willing to do and what they're not willing to do. That's kind of it, I suppose. I suppose the only other thing as well is that transit documents are very, very strict. If you're doing other types of imports and stuff like that, sometimes on air freights and stuff like that, you can kind of retrospectively go back at times and make alterations. Transit documents, they are very, very strict. If we've already seen examples this year in general logistics whereby a truck driver hasn't gone to the correct location that he should have done to discharge his transit document. He's just gone straight to the delivery point that was like 500, 600, 700 miles away from where he should have customs cleared. When that happens, it flags in the system, and basically that truck has to drive all the way back, that you can't retrospectively do anything. So either in those situations, you're either going to end up with a big customs bill, or you have to kind of go back and sort out that transit document properly at source where you have to go to. So.
I've had a couple of questions come in, Tim, which you'll try and tick off these ones. Question from Cole Dukes. If we had, as we frequently do, a single shipment with, say, 30 different types of items, would we have to do a separate document for every item? I'm guessing we mean transit document here as we're on that topic. The question is no, you would only need the one transit document, which would cover all of the commodities underneath that one commercial invoice or that one truck, whatever you're sending out. So you can actually list them all onto one transit document. And I hope that answers that question. And a question for Matthew Carr. We offer a service, coffee and bar events, and we build the service to our client. Would the commercial invoice be based on service we offer in the EU, or would it be based on the individual items like the coffee machines and grinders? Did you want to take that one, Tim?
It should just be based on the coffee machines themselves. There's an element, like when you're doing customs entries and everything else, you are supposed to include things like transport costs and everything else in there, and that's where it falls into the terms of shipment. But effectively, it's just the machines themselves and linking in those transport costs. The service to actually operate those machines don't form part of that commercial invoice. That's a separate thing. I think.
But we do have a question also from Ruth Conway about values on commercial invoice, and I've had a few questions, so I think we'll tick it off and we'll take that towards the end of the presentation and maybe discuss that a little bit towards the end.
Yeah, no worries.
So yeah, did you want to next slide?
Yeah, so the next topic to look at then is carnet. So and this kind of links to transit documents. So one of the ways to kind of a transit document can be sort of quite restrictive in certain areas. So carnets are much easier to deal with, and they basically act, as it sort of says on screen, as a bit of a passport for goods. So it allows temporary import and export of certain goods. And this doesn't just operate within the UK and the EU, it operates in 70 countries all over the world. And it's been a system that's been in place for a long time. Effectively, what it does is, the benefit is if you're the type of company that kind of tends to move the same sort of goods around, then they can all be listed on this carnet, and you can quite easily sort of transit between various countries, getting these carnets sort of stamped off in the relevant countries as and when you go, and you're not having to pay sort of bond fees and everything everywhere you go. They're generally sort of valid for around 12 months. You can do multiple trips on these carnets. Then they don't completely exempt you from everything. If there's any sort of license requirements around military goods, endangered species, that sort of thing, especially that sort of tends to float around with musical instruments and stuff like that. Some can be some sort of form under this CITES section. It doesn't exempt you from any of that, but it makes the customs clearance process a lot easier. It's, you know, that they are there, they're specifically there for commercial samples, exhibition goods, professional equipment, tools, that sort of thing. It's very much for those products that you're going to take to a location and then bring them back afterwards. You can't use a carnet for things consumable, so you couldn't put paint onto, you know, you couldn't put paint onto your carnet. Exhibition giveaways like the brochures and stuff that we mentioned before. Basically, anything that won't return can't go onto the carnet. The idea of the carnet is that you have X amount of items that go in, all of those items have to come back. But it's kind of a much easier process. In theory, once the goods are actually in Europe, in the EU, if you clear them, say, you know, you kind of do your carnet out of the UK, you clear them into France. In theory, once that clearance has been done in France, that carnet and those goods on that carnet then has free movement around the whole of the EU. You don't have to keep them sort of clearing it into each country. It's only when you go back out of the EU that you then need to do another clearance again. Like I say, the negative of the system, if you're the type of company that's going to keep chopping and changing what you're sending all the time, it may not work for you because it's quite a tiny document. That being said, if you've kind of got 10 items on that carnet, you don't necessarily need to ship all 10 each time. As long as it's sort of noted on the voucher, you know, the items say 1 to 9 are going, but 10 isn't, you can use it in that way. So we've sort of seen these in operation for years. We know a lot of kind of production companies, stand builders do use this. A lot of exhibitors do as well. You know, they also use them as well for like the hand carry shipments that they do as well if they're bringing equipment with them. So there is a whole host of benefits attached to carnets. There are some negatives, and I suppose it's up to you guys as individuals to assess what is the better process for you, whether it's going to be to go down, you know, individual customs clearance and transit document routes, or whether it's to look at something like carnets, or it could be a combination of the two.
We've had a few questions come in, Tim, which I'll try and tick off as we go along. Another question from James. Thank you very much. So for a typical stand of wood, aluminium, graphics, AV and furniture, can you reuse the same carnet for different stands? I suppose the answer to this question is, James, carnets really work for items where you reuse all of them. If you're going to dispose of items such as parts of the aluminium, the woods, the wall panels, or the carpet, or the underlay, then carnets aren't really going to work on that aspect because they have to, once the carnet is set, it has to remain the same. Items such as giveaways, brochures, foodstuffs, paints, anything like that doesn't really fit underneath the carnet system. If it's certainly a temporary, I mean, certainly AV and furniture probably would. Obviously for AV, you'd need things such as serial numbers, country of origin, makes, models. But for graphics, that's like a one-use thing and then it gets thrown away. That wouldn't really sit underneath the carnet system. I hope that answers that. We have another question from Francesca about carnets. Does it apply to specific items that have listed on the carnet, or can you ship any products each time under the carnet? We're provided registrations at events, so we'd have different amounts of equipment shipped each time. Francesca, I hope the previous, what I just answered, the previous question answers that. If you're chopping and changing what you're sending, even for registration equipment, you can't reuse the same carnet. If you've got a particular kit, which has got the same serial numbers, it's the same items that you're using for different events and different shows in different countries, then a carnet would work for you. If you're chopping and changing, unfortunately, that wouldn't work for you, and it doesn't really fit underneath the carnet system. I hope that answers that question. One more question we've got from Jack. Can you use multiple carnets for an exhibition? For example, one with 10 regularly used items, 2 other things that are specific to that stand. Yes, you can use multiple carnets for an exhibition stand. That's absolutely fine. So if you've got a particular stand and you can split the stand into sort of 2 or 3 carnets, that's not a problem, as long as it stays within the stipulation that the goods do remain the same that's on there and they're not changed. What does work well when you're doing multiple carnets is if the stand gets split and goes on to different events in different countries, you then have the option to be able to split the stand down. I mean, for the purpose of this sort of webinar, it's quite in depth. I mean, do feel free to contact Tim myself after this if you've got more specific or unique questions about carnets or anything that we're touching on today.
Yeah, and just sort of following on from what Dan said as well. I mean, we've seen examples of that where people are using multiple carnets. You'll kind of see that bits, you know, you might find 5 or 6 carnets coming in for a specific stand, and then they all head off in different directions. They might come in together, but then they all just head off in different directions afterwards. So that premise of kind of using multiple carnets to move stuff around, it's something that's been in place for a while.
Obviously, what we haven't mentioned on this is there is a financial impact of using a carnet. So then you have to speak to either your local chamber of commerce or your local forward about issuing a carnet. There are deposits that need to be laid against the value of the commodity you're declaring when issuing a carnet, and these do range on the countries you're visiting, the length of the carnet that's been issued, but it's 6 months or 12 months, and the value. You know, if you're putting sort of £2-3 million worth of value on a carnet as opposed to 200,000 or 300,000, the price of the carnet will vary. And again, that's something you'd need to speak to your forwarder or the Chamber of Commerce about directly.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of, this is why we say that there isn't kind of a one size fits all, and you kind of need to look at things on an individual basis, because you'll find that when you're looking at that carnet comparison, you're kind of looking at the cost of the carnet against that value that you're lodging there, but then you're looking also at the same time of the value of the bond fees and everything else in the country that you're planning to go to. You can very quickly realise that the carnet is of a, paying that deposit here in the UK to get the carnet to move it is actually better value than having to pay bond fees in all of the countries. For us, it would be much, we'd love it if we could just turn around to you and kind of say, look, this is the best option, that's the best option. But it really is that, unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated in the fact of, different agents, different countries, different mechanisms. It's basically an assessment of what works best for you in relation to costs and everything as well.
We have another question from Adam, who says he has a storage facility in France. Can they use a carnet to transport between the UK and France, then stay locally and then to the venue, used twice yearly at a show? I'd be honest, Adam, it doesn't sound like a carnet would be the best option for this. It does depend on the value and what the commodity actually is. But if the carnet is issued in the UK, if it goes to France, it then must come back to the UK for the carnet to be discharged. It probably could work if it stayed out there for a couple of shows, as long as it does come back to where it originally was dispatched from. I hope that answers that question. Yeah, did you want to move on, Tim, to the next question? I mean, so we've got Q&A at the end here, and I know James has put a couple more questions in, which we'll try and tick off towards the end.
Yeah, fine. So, Hauliers. I suppose this kind of section here is aiming a little bit more at the guys that sort of operate their own trucks and everything else. Brexit is for the guys that sort of previously went into Europe taking their own trucks and everything else. Brexit is going to have an impact on you guys. And sort of on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is an extract from the Hauliers page on the Gov website. And there are very clearly defined responsibilities for various people in the trade, in the chain, sorry. So trader is kind of the company that's shipping the goods in the first place. So it falls on their responsibility to sort out things like customs declarations and make sure the haulage company and driver's got the right information. But the haulage company, it falls on them to ensure that all of the various pre-departure inspections in relation to customs documentation and bits and pieces like that are all in order. And also the driver also has to ensure that they carry all the information. They have to fully understand what they've got to do in their process as well. It's not just they're kind of trying to put the onus on people in the chain. So it's not kind of a fire and forget type of thing and let people get on with it and let them struggle through. They're trying to highlight specific responsibilities so that you don't get these issues. Essentially what they're trying to avoid is big queues of issues at the ports because people haven't got the right documentation. So they're picking at certain processes within the chain and trying to put that responsibility onto a company. There is I have to say that there's a very, very good page on the HMRC website, and the link is included on here. And it goes through a vast array of different things on that page. One of them, as an example, is that obviously this isn't the easiest subject in the world, and on there they have they've set up in the last few months various information advice locations. And there's just a little map on here to kind of give you an idea. Primarily, they're at truck stops and service stations, but effectively, hauliers or anyone that's kind of planning to move trucks into Europe for whatever reason can go to these locations, get a lot more information around that. When it gets into kind of like looking at documentation that needs to be moved, they can sort of get some assistance on that as well. On the same page, it's got a whole host of information about documentation samples that you might come across. So we've talked about transit documents and we've talked about ATA carnets and stuff like that. There are sections on that page that kind of look at those areas and what the haulage company and driver has to do in those when handling those documents. There's kind of a couple of kind of useful checklists depending on what country you're going to and what things you need to be aware of. It breaks it down into sections that if you're going out into Spain or into France, Holland, Belgium, it really breaks it down quite well. Another thing that it sort of touches on is this Kent traffic management process, which you may have heard of this document called the Kent Access Permit. I think it's got a bit of a nickname, Kermit, at the moment as well. But effectively, the whole premise of this system is to avoid those big queues in Kent. Dover is our biggest, most popular port, has the most transit going through it. And the whole idea of this system is to stop, well, this is a personal opinion, sorry. The whole idea of this to me is that this is to stop those big queues down there and basically put the onus on haulage companies before they get to Kent to ensure that they have all their ducks in a row, all the documentation is correct. So effectively that once they get to Kent, they can go to whatever border facility they need to transit out of and then exit the country efficiently. Another thing that sort of pops up on the same page as well is that as part of the Brexit process, primarily in the past, our customs was generally done at port of entry. So whether it was Dover, Harwich, you know, looking over into Wales, you have places like Holyhead or Heysham in Lancashire, those kind of places. That's now changed a little bit. Those, obviously, you can still get customs clearance done at those points, but there's been a couple of extra inland border facilities added into Kent. And also there's been one added in Birmingham as well. And I think there's another one in Warrington. Now, you can't necessarily do all of the same types of clearances at these places. You'll find that places probably like Birmingham and Warrington won't do foodstuffs and some of the, like the CITES, endangered species check things and animal checks and stuff. You'll still have to do those at the main ports of entry. But again, in this section, there's information on where these new border facilities are. And I suppose the other thing to sort of mention as well, it's something that's kind of not fully in at the moment. It's sort of transitioning in. It's in for some examples fully and not for others. Probably didn't explain that very well, but safety and security declarations. Because we are now outside of the EU, there's now an onus for any movement into the EU has to have this safety and security exit declaration. Now, in the past, when we were part of the EU, this system has been in place for a long time, is that primarily anything coming into the UK, if it was coming by truck from outside the EU, let's say as an example, it was Turkey, that safety and security declaration would have been done when it was going into either Bulgaria, Italy, whichever way it was coming in. When we have air freight coming in from other countries outside of the EU, it was being done by airlines and sort of shipping lines were doing stuff for container freight as well. Road freight makes it a little bit more complicated. They're doing this as part of the customs clearance process. There's kind of a couple of different systems that they're doing it. So basically, if you've got somebody doing your customs clearance, they can do these declarations for you. You'll probably just find that you're getting charged for this service, and basically it's sort of linking up all your information and everything else. Again, there's good information on that website about safety and security. It goes into it in a lot more detail. And for those that are looking to operate their own trucks, you know, we kind of suggest the best thing that you can do is kind of just work your way through that page and just effectively at the end of that, you're going to have to make an assessment at the end of whether it's still worth operating your own trucks, taking your own trucks into Europe, or whether it's going to be better for you to try and find a haulier to take goods out into Europe for you.
Yeah, I mean, we had a question come in. It's a good question, really, from Neil Davis, who said how much of the haulage responsibility applies to us if we're using our own drivers and vans. And I think Tim's answered it, Neil, but the bottom line is it's all your responsibility, which would really include customs clearance and issuing all of the transit documents and or carnets, which has been mentioned before. Unfortunately, that really is one of the biggest changes in the new Brexit regulations. As Tim mentioned, you either kind of got to get on board and understand the new regulations, or you start to look to using an outside supplier, an exhibition logistics contractor, or obviously a general forwarder, which works for your business model. I hope that answers that.
And that same issue is being felt by, I mean, let's take it away from exhibitions at the moment. There are, you know, outside of exhibitions, there are a vast number of hauliers within the UK and in Europe that used to transit back and to quite happily and freely. These new regulations that are in place, which aren't just in place for us, they're in place for the EU hauliers as well. You know, there are a vast number of hauliers that are basically at the moment, they've backed out of doing those cross-channel movements, and effectively haulage availability has reduced. There are a number of certainly European trucks that are almost kind of refusing to come into the UK at the moment because they don't want to get trapped, they don't want this to happen. My expectation is that this will settle out. Effectively, the ones that are good at doing this, they will carry on do it. Their business will expand because the companies that don't do it, don't want to do it, can't do it very well, they will lose their business. Their customers will then be looking for somebody else. So what you'll get to is that maybe there's going to be less and less independent hauliers out there that used to be able to just kind of get on with it and move on. Because there's more onus on them now, it might gear them towards like the bigger haulage companies and stuff like that. But then obviously what they will do to meet demand is increase capacity. So what you're going to have is, I suppose, we've got this weird transition period at the moment whilst everything kind of settles out. And you know, hopefully by the time that exhibitions kind of come back properly, a lot of this will be a lot clearer and a lot easier to sort of manage.
That's right, and it answers a lot of questions. We've had an anonymous question come in about, for general exhibition use, can export and import clearance be made at the Birmingham Inland Border Facility? Hypothetically, the answer to that is yes, it can be, but there's so many parameters that says you can or can't do that. It depends on which show it is, if it's an import, if it's an export, where your broker's based, who they're working with. It can be done, but there's a lot of questions that need to be answered before you kind of get to that point as to where the actual border clearance would be made. And I suggest that if anonymous questions got more to ask, then to contact us perhaps after this webinar. There are some other questions coming in, which I say we'll try and tick off towards the end, because I know we're getting towards the end of our time. We've got about 12 minutes, Tim.
Okay, we'll try and crack on then. Right. So the next section is kind of looking, obviously, exhibitions and events. We're just kind of trying to look at a little bit more in and around the temporary movements aspects of it. So obviously we've talked about ATA carnets before, and this may be a benefit to you, but if you don't go down that route and you're looking to move goods on a temporary basis in another way, you kind of, what we want to do is highlight some of the issues in and around that. So what you've got to understand is that if you're moving goods on a temporary basis into and out of countries, they aren't considered free circulation. So handling restrictions apply. Effectively, what happens is the customs duties and taxes, those costs are kind of deferred. So somebody doesn't have to physically pay them there and then, but they don't disappear. Effectively, somebody becomes fiscally responsible for them. So going back pre-Brexit, what would happen if we've got an event here in the UK and I've got an exhibitor in the US that wants us to do a temporary import for them? Basically, I receive the goods in say, Heathrow Airport. I do a temporary import. I lodge that money on our guarantee. Agility, we become responsible for this. So we have to make sure there's control in there. And then obviously when it comes to exporting it afterwards, we kind of go through a process to discharge that liability. So because this liability falls with us or somebody like us, there needs to be an element of control in and around these. So you'll find that if you are going through a temporary import-export process, you may not have some of the flexibility that you had before when you had that free movement. Something on temporary imports, it's, and this isn't a new thing either, because they are not the norm, they tend to flag up more physical checks and document checks and everything else. Pre-Brexit, the majority of stuff that used to come into the UK, again, from outside the EU, and we would do temporary imports on them, they'd hit what's called the Route 1 hold, which is document checks and stuff like that. You'll basically, when you do a customs entry, There are different ways that it can clear. Route 6 means it just immediately it clears. Nobody's checking it. Nobody's bothered about it. It just goes straight through. Route 1, there's a little bit more detail on that. If I'm being honest, and I've sort of keep checking this, again, on government websites, there tends to be a host of temporary import-export guidance. Again, the last time I checked in the last couple of days, there's sections that are updated, but not everything is fully updated at the moment. And there's nothing in there to sort of aid and make movements into the EU any easier. Not that I'm expecting anything, but we're kind of, I suppose we're not overly, we are, if somebody presented us with something now to temporarily import into the UK, it can be done because there's enough there, but they don't go down into all of the various details as to what options are available that they did do before. So just to kind of touch on the different types of temporary movements and things for you to be aware of. So if you're doing an import into the UK, obviously I know that, at stand builders and things like that as well, you may be looking to sort of help out your exhibitor and accept goods coming into the UK for you. The specific procedures for temporary imports, if you're not using a carnet and you're looking to do it on a temporary basis using deferring that liability, like I said before, you'd end up sort of putting onto a guarantee with somebody like us or similar. But then as that holder of that guarantee, HMRC put an onus on us to control that freight as well. So we can't just import something for you, let you have it and do what you want with it whilst we hold the liability. HMRC have there are regulations in around it that if you are temporarily importing goods, it must be controlled. When you do foreign country, when you're sending to international events, just be aware that when they're importing into those countries as well, you will find variations between, and this is even in the EU as well, you'll find variations between countries, shows and agents. That whole combination of who's involved in that process will determine the overarching kind of premise of temporary imports will remain the same, but how they do it will vary. So again, without sort of wanting to use that same phrase again, you'll find that you can't, just because you've done a temporary export out to a show in Spain, in Madrid, don't assume it's exactly the same in Barcelona. You'll find there's variations. And again, when it comes to returning those shipments afterwards, you'll find that because these companies hold that liability for you, they're going to want to manage it quite tightly. So it may be that they don't allow you to arrange your own transport. They'll want to do that themselves, just because they have to control and discharge that liability correctly. Because if something goes wrong, they're not going to chase you, they're going to chase us, them, etc. Okay?
Yep.
Anything else? Questions, Ryan?
We have some other questions. If we go to, we've got a couple more slides, then we'll go to the.
We'll just finish this off then and then hit the question. So just kind of, that was the last main topic, if you like. So just to try and summarize the advice that we're trying to put out there today. Obviously, we've said that on each of these pages that you go through, we put links in there, and when this is shared for whoever wants it, we can make that available. If it's relevant to you, just go and check the relevant guidance in and around it. If you, in some respects, if you do nothing else after this because it's a quiet period, just go and check the EORI number thing, whether you already have it. If you haven't, go through the application process, 5-10 minutes. At least it gets you started and gets something done. Again, whilst we're quiet, going through that guidance and working out what's best for you, it's kind of the perfect time to do that. When we actually come to starting again properly, especially when you're moving into the EU compared to before, you're going to have to sort of consider your logistics much earlier. You're not going to be able to leave it to the last minute. Things like transit documents or carnets or invoices, doing the tariff numbers, all of those things aren't 5-minute jobs. So you are going to have to sort of think about things that are much earlier in the process than maybe you would have done before. You've got options out there. You can engage with a UK agent forwarder like us. There are plenty of other companies like us out there, ESSA members as well. You can sort of, you'll have to engage with that international agent at the other side of the event, or, again, if you're using someone like us, then we'll kind of do that for you and help you through that process. When you're shipping now into the EU, you're going to have to be, I suppose you're going to have to be aware of things like alcohol and food stuff. I suppose you've seen in the press the story about the ham sandwich and everything else. That's probably taking the legislation. It's correct by the letter of the law, but likewise, I also don't believe as well that your Turkish trucks coming in through Bulgaria those guys aren't having their ham sandwiches taken off them either. So there's a little bit of I would say there's probably a little bit of a political game at the moment. So when you're going into, certainly at the moment, the likes of Belgium, Holland, France, etc., they are checking a lot more than they previously would do before, and they are sticking to the letter of the law. There's a lot of, going back to general imports again, there's a lot of food stuff that's sort of moving back into that are hitting these snags because interpretation of the law here in the UK, there are companies that have had stuff that have gone out, general food stuff that have been purely, thoroughly okayed by vets here in the UK doing those documentation. And it's got to Holland and they've gone, no, we don't like that. And then they're stuck and there's nothing they can do about it. And that purely comes down to interpretation. And to be fair, we found that before Brexit, this thing that we mentioned before about different ways of doing things in different countries. We found that before, but obviously it didn't fully impact us because we had free movement. We saw that on cases for American exhibitors coming in and stuff like that. So it's just things that you're just going to have to be a lot more aware. And I suppose the final piece, just to finish this off, is, like I said, well, like we said before, expect changes, a big impact on things like how you did before, customs declarations, liability, etc. It's going to be a lot harder. It's not impossible. You're just going to have to sort of work out the best way to get yourselves through that process. And I'll just sort of touch on something quickly. I'm not going to go through this, but on the PDF that we sent, we'll make available, we've got some other links as well that kind of, there's a Brexit checker on the government website. So I know that we've talked about logistics today as well, but this Brexit checker also helps you in relation to travel and working abroad and everything else as well. There's some extra imports and exports advice. If you really got nothing better to do for the next couple of months, you can bore yourself with the board operating model just to see how things work. And just on shipping terms as well, because some of you may have not seen that before, on our own website, we've kind of got a little guide as to what those terms are, what they mean, and what the responsibilities are and everything as well. So that's kind of it from us.
Okay.
Open it up.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, we've got a few questions outstanding, which we'll try and tick off. Some which was coming on earlier on. I think we've got 5 or 6 questions left. There's a good question from Neil that's been brought up about some CPCs, which we haven't touched on. Have new CPCs been introduced that might simplify the way exhibition goods are imported, temporarily, and exported? I mean, essentially, for everyone out there, CPC is a procedure code with customs that's linked to actual physical customs entries. I think on the CPCs, there has been new ones introduced, but I would always lean on the advice of your broker or agent that you're working with, and they could probably guide you. I think for the purpose of this webinar, going in depth about CPCs is quite deep, and I don't want to confuse everybody about
to be fair, to take that a different way, CPCs existed. We used to import from outside the EU before, so the CPCs that are in place, effectively they're already in position for things like temporary imports, specifically for exhibitions or sporting events or giveaways or anything like that. They still exist. It just means that we're going to have to apply those to EU imports now, whereas before we didn't because it was free movement.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions from James Rook. Do you anticipate contractors asking their clients to make separate arrangements for their display samples? Not specifically. I mean, that's entirely up to the contractor and how they want to deal with their client. Essentially, if you're using a commercial invoice to make a declaration when you do cross the border, when we send you out this PDF link, you'll see on the commercial invoice, there is a column that states if it's like a temporary import, a permanent import, if it's sold, given away, and you can mark down on the one document if it's to be returned or if it is to be given away. Whether you ask your clients to do it separately or not is really a question you need to sort of ask yourselves, and what your relationship with your client is like. I mean, either or can be done on that. I think, would you agree with that, Tim?
Yeah, and let's be honest, again, taking away the Brexit conversation, if I go back to shows where we've dealt with American exhibitors in the past, we know that there are American contractors that have come over and brought, their exhibitor goods with them and everything else, and then kind of done it under that process. So there are mechanisms to do it. I suppose the problem is that I go back to that interpretation comment. It's very hard to sort of we have to, if we're doing something like this, we have to kind of give it by the letter of the law effectively, because we can't be telling you something that isn't factually correct. But when it comes to the reality and the implementation, things tend to be different. You know, that people find ways to get stuff through. People, you know, I can't say that this wouldn't work, that wouldn't work, because if you did it and it did work, then, you know, it's not something that, there are certain things that we couldn't advise you did, but if you did them, you're probably not going to get picked up on it.
I think what we're trying to preach to people today is the kind of the letter of the law as it speaks. You know, the laws state that you can no longer put your, you know, your pot noodles and HB sauce on your truck and sneak it over to a show in Germany, but because it's food stuff, you're supposed to declare them. But the reality is, if you did that, you know, the chances are you probably would get away with it. But that's not necessarily the correct way of doing it. It's not the law. And if you decide to take that risk yourself, then you do jeopardize everything else that you're shipping with it if you decide to bend the rules or ignore them. I think we're trying to give you today is a bit of advice of what the correct procedures should be. There's another question from James that came earlier about commercial invoice route, and is it more efficient than carnets? What I will say is, I would suggest that 95% of the exports that we handle on a regular basis are done with commercial invoices. It's a more standard operating of procedure of going in and out sort of international shows, and probably will be for Europe as well. Carnets generally we use them for professional equipment or equipment with high value, or if a stand is going to multiple shows. If they're not into those kind of realms, I would suggest that a commercial invoice would be a better option for most people, especially if you're looking to move stand fitting type equipment. I hope that helps answer that question. We've had another anonymous message about the dimensions on the commercial invoice, and do we need dims for each item if they're in the box? The answer to that is no. If you've got 16 items inside a flight case or inside a pallet, the external dimensions of the pallet or the flight box is acceptable. We had a question from Ruth earlier on, Tim, just about the values on shipping invoices. This is a good question, actually, and something which gets brought up quite a lot. What is the value that they give on the goods? I'm not clear what the commercial value is, the hire charge, or what the value of the product's in, and what the value would be like if they're lost or stolen.
Yeah, I think we sort of touched on this before.
Yeah.
Again, I suppose there's a bit of an interpretation thing here, is that I would possibly, you know, from my perspective, I'd probably exclude the service element of that and then be looking at the cost of the goods. But then you also have to factor in through the terms that you have on there, depending on how you do it. And most when you're going to exhibitions and you're trying to do the customs entry at the other end, most agents who do that customs entry for you will want you to include like a CIF type value. So in theory, you're looking at the value of the furniture and, by letter of the law, a little bit of your transport costs and everything else involved in that as well. Realistically though, if I, you know, on the ground, going back to this, you know, I know for a fact that the majority of people, when they're doing their commercial invoices, they don't factor in a lot of that stuff. And then they just look at the value of the goods and everything else. There's a bit of an argument, again, without sort of trying to sort of take this too far out of turn, there's a bit of an argument that when we're moving these goods temporarily, in theory, all the duty is being suspended across the process and VAT and everything else, and nobody actually pays anything in the end, because it basically moves around under this deferred liability, and at the end of it, no one pays anything. So in effect, no governments are being done out of any money by you doing that. You would probably get hit a lot more if you were selling goods, because obviously if you're under declaring the value of goods that you're selling, then that's a different issue, because when they buy it, there are actual duties and taxes to pay. So it's, you know, to me, the value of the actual equipment itself should be okay.
I've got a couple of other questions. Adam's just dropped in regards to a stand crate for a custom build. How much detail needs to be listed? For example, screws, cable ties, paintbrushes and glue sticks. So the correct answer to this question, Adam, is everything. And that sounds really anal, I know. I've got 372 screws, 41 cable ties. as I said 5 minutes ago, I'm preaching to you what the regulations state, and they state you need to be specific with exactly what you're sending. The likelihood of somebody stopping you and counting every screw in a box is pretty minimal, and it's very unlikely ever to happen. And you probably would get away with writing, you know, 1 box of screws or 3 boxes of screws, which I think would be deemed acceptable. But the letter of the law does say to name exactly how many pieces there are.
And just to cover that, I mean, going back to pre-Brexit, we have examples for shows coming into the UK that people wouldn't even go to that nth degree and literally just kind of put exhibition stand, and that could be made up of all sorts of stuff. Now, there are some countries that will very specifically not allow you to just put exhibition stand. There are other ones that are a little bit more flexible. The problem you've got is that what will realistically happen is most of the time you may get away with it. It might just be the one time that someone sort of digs into it a little bit more, isn't very happy with you, and you get stuck. That's where, like I say, we have to be sort of quite specific about what we say. But I can also sort of say as well, we know of examples that, you know, you put exhibition stand on an invoice and it comes into the UK and you put a tariff number against it, it's not queried. So
I think when it comes to that, you are right. I mean, exhibition stand can be used as a generic, you know, I'm shipping 1 complete exhibition stand, but when it gets here, if it's then got TV screens and, you know, PCs and routers, that's when customs start to get a bit fidgety and say, well, that's not part of an exhibition stand. If it's a prefabricated, you know, you're looking at wall panels, floor panels, carpets, underlay, you possibly, and maybe some light fittings even, you may get away with it. But I would suggest certainly short term, until, you know, the Brexit has calmed down a little bit and the rules are a little bit simplified and people are a little bit more fair about what the import and export procedures are, I would stick to being a complex list of what's actually within your stand. It could well be in 6 months, you'll find that some customs regulations do accept 1 complete stand. But certainly for now, I wouldn't advise that. It's probably not the best route to go down. I hope it answers that question. I think.
Do we need to wrap this up, Andrew, or are we happy?
Yeah,
I think we're closing in. I have, you know, there are a few people who are having to drop out, but equally, you know, I suppose people could probably come up with questions every few minutes, and we could keep going for a long time. And it may be that we can run another session in the future. I mean, this has been recorded, so we will be distributing this session soon. We will be distributing that with the PDF that the guys have created to cover all the main areas. Within that documentation, there'll be your details. Yeah. I you know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you're very happy to answer any questions offline which might pop into people's heads within reason, I'm sure. Equally, if people want to send those questions to me, I will make sure they get to the guys as well, and we can add them to a Q&A document that we can distribute when we wrap up this event in a week or so's time, when we send out the video and so on. But I think we do need to wrap it up, otherwise I think we could continue well beyond midday. So sorry for those who maybe haven't quite had those questions answered. They are recorded. We will be noting them down and getting the answers. I think this exemplifies for me the benefit of surrounding yourself with experts. So thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, Tim, for what has been a really informative session. And I would imagine, I mean,